The hero's battle against the dragon represents an internal struggle against the unconscious, and an external struggle against the chaos which manifests in the world. Subduing this chaos puts mankind on the path to a higher consciousness, and it is the ego's desire to rid itself of the power of the maternal unconscious, which has allowed mankind to transition from archaic primitive beings into modern conscious beings. But what is it that fights against nature? It is the spiritual realm of heaven, predominantly characterized as masculine, which imposes its will on human nature, controlling our instinctual side, and pulling society together. A society's laws and customs, which are culturally reinforced, oppose nature, leading mankind upwards into the spiritual heights. It is the masculine spirit whose authority binds cultural values together and passes them on to the next generation. The world of the fathers is thus the world of collective values. It is historical, and related to the fluctuating level of conscious and cultural development within the group. The prevailing system of cultural values, i.e., the canon of values which gives the culture its peculiar physiognomy and its stability, has its roots in the fathers, the grown men, who represent and reinforce the religious, ethical, political, and social structure of the collective. Since it is the masculine authority who is responsible for the growth of consciousness and the pulling away from nature, it may seem as though it is important to obey this authority. However, there is a danger in blindly obeying authority figures and the doctrines they impose upon us. Just as the mother archetype prevents us from being independent, so too can the father archetype restrict our freedom and prevent us from growing. The ego naturally seeks autonomy, meaning it doesn't want to be reliant on others, and wishes to be the master of its own destiny. This desire for mastery is partly a consequence of our desire to be at the top of the dominance hierarchy, and thus displace the elders there. But that is not all that is going on. As the collective cultural values and rules restrict the hero's freedom, he develops a will to break away from their influence, seeking independence. This desire is so profound that it can be found in myths as the slaying of the father motif. The slaying of the mother was ultimately about fighting chaos, but the slaying of the father is about overcoming excessive order. Although order can be good for a society, it can also be limiting, and may create the desire for freedom. The father represents the father archetype, whose authority gives rise to cultural expectations. He acts, as it were, like a spiritual system which, from beyond and above, captures and destroys the son's consciousness. This spiritual system appears as the binding force of the old law, the old religion, the old morality, the old order, as conscience, convention, tradition, or any other spiritual phenomenon that seizes hold of the son and obstructs his progress into the future. This father may be represented as a paternal deity or as the personal father of the hero in the myth. In normal circumstances, nobody questions the authority of the law or of cultural norms, and in fact, there is no reason to question them. This is partly because having shared collective values and expectations helps to maintain cohesion within a society. The problem with this, however, is that it prevents a society from experimenting in new ways, which could be beneficial and lead the collective consciousness in new directions. Sticking too firmly to the old beliefs makes it impossible to learn new things and adopt new ways of living. This is why the father who is overthrown appears as a tyrant who strictly enforces the law. In the hero's journey, the hero often becomes dissatisfied with their own ordinary world, as they begin to see that the rules and regulations which govern their own society are not set in stone, and that perhaps there are other ways to live. The hero often discovers these alternate ways of being by exploring other parts of the world and meeting the people who live there. The hero's journey is ultimately about discovering something new and bringing it back in order to enrich life. However, the old authority, represented by the father, may stubbornly cling to past traditions and traditional values. What makes the hero unique is his or her courage to strike out against the norm and challenge the prevailing authority. The average person lacks the courage or the will to challenge the established doctrine, and so never rebels against authority. But the hero feels the desire to displace the reigning law and replace it with a better way. This is why Zeus challenges and defeats his father Cronus, since he desires to be free from the tyranny of the old king, just as Kronos overthrew his father Uranus. Tyranny is a serious threat to mankind's higher consciousness, since being too rigidly attached to traditional beliefs prevents creativity. The creativity of consciousness may be jeopardized by religious or political totalitarianism, for any authoritarian fixation of the canon leads to sterility of consciousness. The myth of the Norse gods, known as the Aesir, fighting against the frost giants, also represents this mythological idea, as a new power attempts to displace the ruling power and succeeds. Other myths, such as the battle between David and Goliath, or of Krishna and the tyrannical king Kamsa, also replay this theme. At the psychological level, all of these struggles can be regarded as the struggle against the superego, the part of ourselves which conforms to modern rules and expectations. Since the goal of consciousness is to expand outwards and make new discoveries, tyrannical rulers and their restrictive laws can prevent the growth of new knowledge. The ego seeks freedom, for which reason it opposes tyranny and totalitarianism, because this freedom is the soil in which a higher consciousness grows. In order to establish a new order, the hero battles against the father archetype. This necessarily makes the hero a breaker of the old law. He is the enemy of the old ruling system, of the old cultural values, and the existing court of conscience, and so he necessarily comes into conflict with the fathers and their spokesman, the personal father. A society can only evolve if it is willing to question its pre-established beliefs. The desire for self-mastery, independence, and freedom gives rise to stories about people who rebel against a tyrannical ruler, such as the Israelites fighting against the Pharaoh. The rebellion against a dictator is a common trope in stories, and these stories speak to us at a psychological level, since we all desire freedom. However, this does not only play out in fiction, but also in history, as the desire to bring about freedom and replace the old system with a new, better system, for which many dictators in history were overthrown, and many revolutions attempted to bring about social change. Perhaps the best-known example of this in the West was the American Revolution, where the old dictatorial monarchy was replaced with a democratic system, which idealized values of liberty and self-determination. However, not all attempts to overthrow tyranny lead to a positive outcome, and in many cases, even worse forms of tyranny emerged. All these stories also relate to each of us at the personal level, and represent our desires to break from normality rather than conforming to social expectations, since only in this way can we truly be ourselves. The instinct to conform to the expectations of others is met with an instinct to be different from others, and following this latter instinct can lead to alienation from others. However, it is only by following our own path, and not simply following the collective, that we can discover new ideas, and enrich our own lives and the lives of others. This breaking from the norm can be witnessed in all forms of artistic expression, where it is necessary to experiment with new ideas, at the risk of being deemed strange or subversive. Even our scientific discoveries largely depend upon abandoning the norms set up by the previous generation. Albert Einstein made his discoveries by challenging the prevailing wisdom of the scientists who came before him, and was severely criticized by his colleagues, who deemed him mad. However, by going against the pre-established doctrine, he was able to make massive contributions to science, which have changed how we understand the universe. This is why it is important to challenge the rules and expectations which exist in a society, whether it be for creative or for moral reasons. We can't assume that the way things are is perfect, and we must always strive to make society better by experimenting with new modes of existence. There is always a risk that the changes we make may be too radical and lead to chaos, but chaos and order must be balanced as to ensure the optimal society. Just as chaos can be destructive, excessive order from tyrannical leaders can also be dangerous, but it is only by taking the leap into the unknown that we will ever know what human societies may achieve.